Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the General Misconduct Podcast. This is part 2 of our 2-part series on General Conrad von Hotzendorf. If you have not already listened to the first part, I urge you go listen to that before you take a listen to today's episode. Now, when we left off, our good friend Conrad had just been fired from his position as Chief of Staff due to some disagreements with the foreign minister as well as with the emperor, and due to the fact that he had been carrying on an extramarital affair with a married woman. Now, this is going to be followed by about a 10-month period where he's going to be out of office. Just a little spoiler alert, he is going to reassume his position by the end of 1912. But during that time, there's going to be different things that are going to be happening both within and outside the empire. Namely, in Hungary, there's a change-up in the parliament where the previously, kind of pacifist, well, not necessarily pacifist, but kind of the, how should I put this, kind of the anti-army, I guess you could say, kind of an anti-army party, or more pro-Hungarian party, which had been the reason for the KUK lagging behind on rearmament because they weren't supportive of it. That party that had been that hindrance and kind of a headache for Conrad for quite a few years ends up getting ousted in 1912 and is replaced by a more pro-imperial, pro-army party who kind of recognizes that in order for Hungary to be strong, the empire needs to be strong. So they come in and basically become fully supportive of rearmament and begin supplying more men to the army. Of course, this is something that the empire needs, considering that Hungary is the largest by landmass of all the countries that are part of the empire. So all of a sudden they have they have Hungary on their side finally after years. But while that happens, Austria, which is kind of the seat of the empire, they're the kind of the leading power within, they end up flipping their position as well. Whereas they had been controlled by a pro-army Christian Socialist Party for quite a while. That party ends up getting ousted that same year as well, and is replaced with more of a kind of more pro-pacifist social democrat party. So the two major powers within the empire end up flipping on an issue that had been pretty contentious for the past several years, as long as Conrad had been in that position of Chief of Staff. As well as that happening, outside the empire near its borders, another Balkan war had kind of kicked off in 1912 as well. And due to this, along with the death of Foreign Minister Arenthal, which was that was the individual who had a really big kind of back and forth with Conrad that got Conrad removed from office in the first place, he ends up passing away earlier that year. And so this kind of urges the emperor at the behest of Franz Ferdinand to give Conrad his job back. Now, the two, Conrad and Franz Ferdinand, as I stated in the previous episode, had a friendship, but by this time had been, pretty contentious. They were no longer nearly as close. This is true of Conrad with pretty much any personal relationship in this period, and that's going to be how it is going forth. And that was just had to do more so with the death of his wife earlier on, and it's going to end up having a pretty wide impact on how the wars end up, how it's going to end up going. Now, luckily for Conrad, during this time, during his 10-month absence from office, is what I'll call it, during that time, almost a completely new cabinet is put in the war cabinet. A group of staff officers and generals who were more sympathetic to Conrad's pro-war cause. They end up taking up the majority of the military's upper echelons and in the war cabinet. So all of a sudden, when Conrad comes back into his job in December 1912, he's now surrounded by allies, whereas when he was ousted, he was kind of outnumbered. So he gets back into the job, and by the time that he gets back in there, he's immediately calling for war in the Balkans to support the Ottomans, who were at the time fighting Serbia. So he sees this as another chance to take out Serbia in a preventative conflict, which, is, if you remember from the previous episode, was one of his big goals. But unfortunately for him, this is going to be another missed opportunity. The Germans end up intervening mostly on the behalf of the Ottomans, in order to negotiate a temporary ceasefire in early 1913. And this works for a time. Hostilities were paused, but they end up resuming later that year. Conrad again tries to get involved in the conflict and is rebuffed by the Emperor Franz Joseph. And by the end of the year, the conflict is over, so Conrad again misses his chance for a war with Serbia. Also note that year in 1913, whatever was left of the kind of working relationship with Archduke Franz Ferdinand is pretty much completely over at this point. The only correspondence those two are going to have up until Ferdinand's death in June of 1914 is going to be only, it's minimal and it's official business at that. So that relationship is completely broken. So Conrad, no lost love between either of them. And so it's going to be kind of interesting how Conrad's going to kind of change that narrative later on in 1914 after the assassination of the Archduke. Now, by the beginning of 1914, Conrad had kind of begun to recognize the reality of the situation that he and the KUK and the Empire were in. The state of the Empire versus its opponents, as you remember, was not an advantageous position. They were being outspent by every single major power in Europe by, 2, 3, and sometimes fourfold in the cases of Germany and France, as well as being outspent threefold by Russia, and the Italians, while not as far ahead, were outspending them as well. Really, the only power that Austria-Hungary was worried about that wasn't outspending them was Serbia, and that was just due to the very small size of that country at that time. However, the Serbians during the early 19-teens prior to World War I also had opportunities to rearm and prepare for conflict as they were continuing to fight conflicts in the Balkans against the Ottomans. So Conrad ends up making an about-face on his position of preventative wars as a result of all this, and he begins advocating for closer ties with Germany as well as expanding the Triple Alliance. If you remember, the Triple Alliance was between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, which Conrad had always viewed as a potential enemy. I never saw them more than anything as kind of like he always viewed them as kind of traitors and backstabbers. And this had to do more with the fact that he had personally fought them in the early 1900s when he was a brigade commander. So he's going to always kind of advocate for a preventative war with Italy, because he saw at worst they were going to join the enemy in case of a war, and at best they wouldn't come to Austria-Hungary's aid. So seeing this, he is always going to be advocating for an expansion of the Triple Alliance, especially as 1914 kicks off, and he's going to try to get neutral states such as Sweden to join the Triple Alliance. Also, to make a little note, while Conrad and his German counterpart Helmuth von Moltke agreed to, greater cooperation between the Germans and the Empire, they both saw that any future conflict in Europe, the two were going to need to rely heavily on each other, especially on the Eastern Front against a potential conflict with Russia. The two never really make an effort to actually coordinate any kind of joint training exercises, any kind of joint future operations, or any kind of joint planning. And really all this, this sudden change in Conrad, which was positive, kind of falls apart by March 1914. So it doesn't last very long. And by that time, he's actually calling for a preventative war once again, but this time it was against Romania, which at the time was an ally, at least in some sense, to Austria-Hungary. So this is another case of Conrad, in the same vein as the Italians, he was looking at somebody who politically was aligned with the imperial government, but he saw them as, potential enemies in the future, and he wanted to knock them out. So, again, he's causing quite a stir, but at this point, he's got so much support in the war cabinet that he can't be ousted at this point. Nothing's ever going to come of that prior to July 1914 when the war kicks off, but just so you know, Romania does end up siding with the Allied powers, and it is in due part to Conrad's kind of saber rattling in early 1914, along with there's going to be a lot of other things with that, but that's kind of a gross oversimplification. But just know that plays part in it, and I felt it necessary to make a note of that. Now, moving on, we want to get to the fun stuff, World War I, right? So all the ills that kind of had persisted in the KUK throughout Conrad's career, if you remember the, underspending issues, the rearmament issues, the manpower issues, all of those had, persisted up until the summer of 1914. And Conrad understood this, but not to the degree that it would stop him from plunging his nation into its final war. So we're going to see here, right before June 1914, kind of we're just going to touch on some of the bigger issues that are going to face the military because of Conrad's kind of an arrogance in a way. So he understood the military was lagging behind. He knew the rearmament was an issue, the manpower what had been an issue. But he hadn't taken into account that his potential enemies, Serbia and Russia, were actually kind of fully prepared for a full-scale war at this point. He had neglected the fact that Serbia, due to its kind of past couple years of conflict in the Balkans, had almost entirely, they're pretty much fully mobilized by the time the war is going to kick off. And he also underestimated the lengths at which Russia had gone to modernize its mobilization efforts. Worse still, his elaborate plans that he had devised to take on both Serbia and Russia never accounted for having to take on both at the same time. He always thought that they would be individual conflicts. And in the case of Russia, the reliance on Germany flanking to the north was also a critical piece. But he never, like I said, planned any kind of joint operations with the Germans prior to the war beginning. So he had this idea of how an offensive or defensive position would look against the Russians, but he never decided to actually plan anything with the Germans, who were going to be a major piece in that puzzle, whether they were on the offense or the defense. And kind of the final nail in the coffin was his personal disregard for intelligence that was provided to him by the Germans, specifically in the area of the Russian railway systems. Now, like I said, Russia had taken they'd gone to great lengths to really modernize mobilization efforts. So in the mid and late 19th century, they had this big push to modernize their railways, leading kind of from the western border with all of Europe deeper into the interior, in order so that they could mobilize their armies westward at kind of rapid speeds, because a lot of the manpower is going to be coming from the interior of Russia, and they want to be able to get to their border very quickly, so they modernize their railways in order to move their men as fast as possible. And the Germans knew this and attempted to convince Conrad of this fact, but Conrad ignored it and instead operated off of Russian railway intelligence from 40 years prior, around the time of the Franco-Prussian War. He's operating off of old maps and timetables, and this is really going to end up having a major blow to the early days of the war on the Eastern Front, because ignoring this intelligence is going to leave that eastern flank wide open, and the Russians are going to successfully mobilize 2/3 of their entire force in less than 3 weeks. I think it's 18 days they're able to mobilize, 2/3 of their already mobilized force, which is, probably over 1 million men or something like that. It's crazy how fast the Russians are actually able to do it. And despite the fact that the Germans are aware of this, they're actually going to underestimate it as well. But yeah, that's going to be a major factor into why the war goes so poorly early on for the Empire. And with that, we will take you to the first commercial break, if they actually decide to play an ad this time where I put them. I know there were some issues in last week's episode with that. At least that's what I saw on my end. But hopefully this actually plays. So we'll be right back after this break. And we are back. Now, when I left off, we were just talking about how, Conrad was failing to kind of recognize intelligence reports that had been provided to him, and it's going to hurt the Empire in the early parts of the war. And now we're going to move on to the actual beginning of the First World War.